Kendra Lawson walked into court for a minor traffic ticket and walked straight into a public lynching in suits and badges. Two white cops laughed loud enough for the jury to hear, whispering slurs the judge pretended not to notice. But just as the gavel was about to fall, her phone buzzed with 6 words that froze her blood. They have no idea who you are. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Charleston County Courthouse had an echo that made everything sound colder than it should. Every cough, every shuffle of shoes, every whispered comment stretched across the room like a shadow. The mahogany benches were polished to a shine, but the air was heavy with an old kind of judgment, the kind that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. Kendra Lawson sat at the defense table, her hands resting on the edge, fingers interlaced. Her nails were short and clean, painted in a neutral shade, not because she cared about appearances, but because she knew every detail about her today would be judged. Her hair was pulled back into a low bun, sleek, not a strand out of place. It wasn't vanity, it was armor. The charge against her was so small it barely deserved court time. A supposed reckless lane change that the ticketing officer had upgraded to a dangerous driving violation. But somewhere between her arrest and today's trial, the accusation had grown teeth. The prosecution wasn't just trying to fine her, they were trying to smear her character, painting her as a lawless, angry black woman who couldn't be trusted behind the wheel, much less in society. At the far side of the room, Sergeant Blake Morrissey leaned back in his chair, his police uniform pressed sharp as if he were preparing for a parade. Beside him, Officer Dan Keller chewed on a toothpick, his lips curling into a grin that didn't belong in a courtroom. Their eyes weren't on the judge, they weren't on the lawyers, they were on her. When Kendra took the stand to give her side of the story, she could feel them watching her like she was entertainment. The snickering began when she mentioned that she'd been on her way to a community volunteer event the night she was pulled over. Guess she's an inspiration to her people. Keller muttered, his voice low enough to pretend it wasn't meant to be heard, but loud enough to ripple through the jury box. A couple of jurors pressed their lips together, pretending they hadn't heard. Morrissey chuckled under his breath, and the sound, sharp and smug, cut through Kendra's testimony like a blade.
The judge didn't react, not a glance, not a word of reprimand. It was as though the behavior didn't exist, as though the decorum of the court applied to everyone but them.
And that silence was louder than anything. Kendra's pulse quickened, not out of shame, but out of recognition. This was not new. Her grandmother had told her stories about courtrooms in Alabama during the Jim Crow era, where black defendants were laughed at, their words twisted, their dignity stripped before their eyes. She had thought that was history, but here it was again, history, dressed in a modern suit, hiding behind procedural formality. From the back row, local reporters scribbled notes in lined pads. A few wore half smiles at the officer's mockery, as though it were harmless banter. Just another bit of flavor for tomorrow's news article. Kendra swallowed hard, forcing her voice to remain steady. She kept her shoulders square, her posture perfect. Every word she spoke was measured. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. The prosecutor, a man in his late 40s with a too-perfect tie knot, leaned forward on his lectern. "Miss Lawson," he began with a tone that dripped with condescension, "isn't it true that your license was already in a probationary period due to a prior incident?" It wasn't true, not in the way he meant it. Years ago, she'd had a clerical error on her driving record that had been cleared within weeks. But the way he framed it now, it sounded like a criminal habit. Kendra explained the truth calmly, but she could feel the shift in the room. The prosecutor's insinuation had landed. The jury wasn't hearing facts anymore. They were hearing a story they already knew how to finish. Her attorney, a young public defender fresh out of law school, shifted uneasily beside her. He looked like he wanted to object but wasn't sure on what grounds. And she knew in her bones, that if she had walked in here with a different skin tone, a different history, this case would already be over. The trial moved with a slow cruelty. Every question another thread pulled from her dignity. By the time closing arguments began, she wasn't angry. She was something sharper, more precise. She was waiting. The judge shuffled some papers, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. "In light of the evidence and testimony," he began, his tone flat, "the court is prepared to move to sentencing." There it was, the final performance. No deliberation, no serious weighing of facts. Just the execution of a decision that had likely been made before she even stepped through the courthouse doors. Kendra's eyes flicked to the officers. Morrissey leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, a slow grin spreading across his face, as though this were the moment he had been anticipating all morning. Keller rested his chin in his palm, pretending to look bored, but the sparkle in his eyes gave him away, and then, a vibration against her thigh. Her phone, tucked deep in her blazer pocket, buzzed once, then twice. She shifted her weight, sliding her hand in subtly, pulling it free under the table. The screen lit up with a single notification, a message from a number she hadn't seen in years. It wasn't a name, just a sentence. They're not ready for who you really are. The air in the courtroom felt different in that moment, heavier, sharper, as if the words on her phone had tilted the whole balance of the room. Her heart didn't race. It slowed. Steady. Focused. That sentence was a trigger from her past. A phrase tied to a part of her life that no one in this room, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not the smirking officers, knew existed. It meant something was about to change. The judge's voice droned on, but Kendra wasn't hearing the words anymore. She was hearing the hum of something bigger, something she had hoped she'd left behind but now felt rising again. Her grandmother's stories were still in her blood, but so were years of training, years of operating in spaces where silence was a weapon, and patience was the deadliest tool of all. The smirks on the officers' faces blurred at the edges of her vision. The court's stale air seemed to crackle, and in that charged stillness, Kendra understood. This was no longer just about a traffic violation. This was about to become war. The judge lifted his gavel to deliver her sentence, and Kendra's thumb hovered over the phone screen, ready to respond to the message that could rewrite the entire game. The recess bell had no grace, just a sharp metallic clang that sent the courtroom's murmur spilling into the hallway like a low tide. Jurors shuffled out through the side door, stretching, whispering, avoiding her eyes. Kendra remained seated for a moment, her gaze fixed on the prosecution table. Morrissey and Keller were leaning toward the prosecutor, lips barely moving, the rhythm of their glances telling her more than words could. When she finally rose, the bailiff shadowed her down the narrow aisle, his step half a beat behind hers, like he'd been instructed to keep her within reach, without appearing to. In the hallway, the courthouse smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old paper. The fluorescent lights buzzed with the fatigue of decades.
Miss Lawson.
The voice came from her left, measured, low, as though speaking to a skittish animal. It was the prosecutor, Martin Calhoun. Tall, broad-shouldered, his suit hung on him like it had been altered by someone who didn't know his shape. His eyes had the gleam of a man who believed he could sell anything if he smiled slow enough. He gestured toward a bench tucked beneath a dusty portrait of a retired judge. A word? Kendra didn't sit. She leaned back slightly, arms loose at her sides. If it's about the case, my attorney, this is off the record. His tone dropped further. You plead guilty, pay the fine, and we end it here. No jail, no probation, no more headlines. It wasn't the offer itself that made her stomach tighten. It was the practiced casualness of it, like the words had been rehearsed, like this was the closing act of a scene that had been playing out in other hallways for years. She tilted her head slightly. That's generous for someone you're painting as a menace to traffic safety. He smiled. Sometimes we do what's best for all parties. The officers don't have to keep coming in here. The court clears a case off the docket, and you move on. The word move rang in her chest with the same hollow note as stay quiet. She recognized the architecture of the ploy immediately. She'd seen it before in her FBI training days. Back then, she'd been sent into departments where this kind of deal was a currency, a way to launder reputations under the guise of efficiency. It was never about the accused. It was about the narrative. Her mind flickered back to a precinct in Ohio, where she'd once listened through a wall as a lieutenant told a rookie, "Get them to sign and you never have to explain yourself again." She'd spent months dismantling that culture, collecting memos, catching winks exchanged in budget meetings, watching the way one bad arrest got buried under 100 signatures. Now, she was the target of that same machinery. She scanned Calhoun's posture, the slight cant of his shoulders toward the officers leaning against the far wall. Morrissey's arms crossed but his chin tilted in subtle anticipation. Keller tapping his thumb against his belt, in a slow, steady beat. The judge, halfway down the hallway with a clerk, glanced over once, then quickly away. It wasn't a glance of curiosity. It was a check-in, a silent confirmation that the script was moving. As they weren't three separate men, they were a single organism, connected by years of unspoken understandings, favors traded in back rooms, and the shared certainty that their world was unassailable. Calhoun shifted, mistaking her silence for hesitation. Look, Miss Lawson, if you push this, things get messy. Sometimes messy is worse than guilty. She thought of every woman she'd seen in these hallways over the years. The ones who didn't have her training, who couldn't decode the game being played in front of them. Women who took deals they didn't deserve, just to get their lives back, only to carry the stain forever. The unspoken lesson was always the same. Don't step out of place. Don't expect fairness. Learn the choreography, or we'll teach it to you the hard way. Her attorney rounded the corner just in time to catch the last words. His brows lifted. What's going on here? Calhoun stepped back, lifting his palms in a mock display of transparency. Just exploring options for efficiency. I'll put it in writing if she's interested. I'm not, Kendra said, her voice even. The prosecutor's smile didn't falter, but something behind his eyes stiffened. Suit yourself. He turned away, muttering something to Morrissey as he passed. Kendra didn't move immediately. She let herself absorb the hallway, the faint click of the clerk's shoes down the corridor, the shuffle of papers from a nearby office, the way Morrissey's smirk deepened as if he'd just been handed a win. Her attorney whispered, "You sure? This could end today." "Not for me," she said, "and not for them." When they returned to the courtroom, she noticed the choreography again. How Morrissey leaned toward the judge's bench during the minute before the session resumed. How Keller adjusted the mic stand at the prosecution's table without being asked. How the judge's gavel landed with a softness that signaled familiarity more than authority. The proceeding picked up, but every question, every ruling had the rhythm of something prearranged. Even the jury seemed to sense it, their expressions sliding toward boredom, as if they were watching a play whose ending had been spoiled. But she was watching something else. The momentary tightening of Morrissey's jaw, when she refused to nod along with her attorney's objections. The quick flick of Calhoun's eyes toward the gallery, when certain words were said. They weren't mocking her now. They were assessing. For the first time that day, she saw it. A tiny fissure in their confidence. The deal hadn't been a kindness. It had been an insurance policy. Her refusal had just burned it. As the session dragged, Keller tried to catch her gaze, to throw her off with a faint grin, but it faltered. Morrissey kept his eyes on the bench, but his pen tapped against the table in an uneven rhythm. The judge cleared his throat more often than he spoke. And beneath it all, Kendra felt the air shift, the way it does when a storm is still far but already changing the pressure in your lungs. When the recess ended, Calhoun's voice was flatter, his questions tighter. The easy charm was gone, replaced by precision. It was the tone of someone recalculating in real time. Her attorney leaned close between questions. "You rattled them." "I know," she said. A faint color had crept into Morrissey's face now, not from anger, but from something he hadn't expected to feel in this courtroom. Uncertainty. She held his gaze once, just long enough for him to know she saw it. His smirk returned for half a second, then dropped away entirely, replaced by the smallest flicker of something else. Fear. The courthouse doors closed behind her with the kind of finality that told you not to come back, unless you had to. Evening had smudged the Charleston sky into deep blues and burnt orange, street lamps flickering to life one reluctant bulb at a time. The air was warm but sharp, carrying the faint tang of salt from the harbor. Kendra's heels clicked against the cracked pavement of the side lot where she'd parked that morning. From a distance, her car looked like it had been swallowed by shadow. But as she drew closer, the shape of the damage emerged in pieces. The front windshield bore a spiderweb of fractures, each one catching the last light of the day like veins of ice. Both drivers' side tires sagged, flat and defeated, and the hood was screaming in crude black spray paint. 3 words so vile she felt the letters burn into her skin without even reading them aloud. For a long moment she stood there, hands at her sides, chin slightly lifted. No gasp, no curse, just stillness. The courthouse security cameras pointed in the direction of her car were dark, little red indicator lights unlit. She didn't need to ask why. The malfunction had been part of the plan. A man in a janitor's uniform pushed a mop bucket past the far end of the lot, glancing up just long enough to see her, then lowering his eyes quickly. He kept moving, the mop water sloshing like an alibi he wanted to keep. She could have pulled out her phone, taken photographs, filed a report that would vanish into the same file where all such complaints went to die. But Kendra knew better. Evidence in this city wasn't about proof. It was about power. Whoever had done this wasn't afraid of being caught. They were counting on her to play the part of the rattled victim. Instead, she slid her keys back into her purse and walked away. The sound of her heels didn't change tempo, didn't quicken with anger, or slow with hesitation. Her grandmother had always said, "Don't let them see you scramble, baby. Scrambling is what they feed on." As she rounded the block toward King Street, her mind replayed FBI counter-surveillance drills. Not the classroom kind, but the ones Isaac had put her through in the field. The rules were simple. If they think you're flustered, they push harder. If they think you're planning something, they second-guess themselves. And if they can't tell the difference, you own the game. She passed a row of boutique shops closing for the night. The glow of mannequins in summer dresses spilled onto the sidewalk, the illusion of a safe, polite Charleston brushing against the truth she had just walked away from. She kept her eyes forward, noting the reflection in a storefront window, a dark SUV idling half a block behind her. It didn't follow when she cut down a narrow side street toward a small diner she knew well. The place was half-lit, neon letters in the window stuttering the word open into uneven syllables. Inside, it smelled of coffee that had been sitting since mid-afternoon, and fryer oil that had been used one time too many. A few truckers hunched over plates of pie, their conversations low and unimportant. Kendra slid into the last booth in the corner, her back to the wall so she could see both the door and the narrow hallway to the kitchen. She ordered a cup of coffee she didn't plan to drink. From her purse, she pulled out a worn leather notebook. The edges were frayed, the binding cracked from years of being opened in rooms just like this. This was not the place for a defense strategy. She'd leave that to her public defender. This was for something else entirely. She began to write. Not in bullet points or neat paragraphs, but in streams of detail. Names, dates, faces, small tells in body language. The way Morrissey's eyes had cut toward the judge during recess, the way Calhoun's voice dropped half an octave when he offered her the deal, the way the clerk had paused before swearing her in, like someone had whispered in her ear a second too late. Each note was an anchor for later, for when she would start pulling threads until the whole fabric tore. She didn't need to know exactly how the next move would play out yet. Planning wasn't about a fixed path, it was about knowing where the cracks were before anyone else realized they existed. Her pen moved with a steady rhythm. The waitress came by once, refilled the untouched coffee, and walked away without comment. But the door's small bell chimed, and she felt the air shift before she looked up. A man walked in wearing a dark jacket, despite the warm night. His shoes were too polished for someone stopping in for pie. He scanned the room once, his gaze sliding over the truckers, pausing just a moment too long on her before he moved toward the counter. She kept writing, eyes on the page, but her awareness sharpened. She watched him in the periphery, as he ordered water, then casually turned to lean against the counter, his view of her now unobstructed. 10 minutes passed. The truckers left. The waitress disappeared into the back. Her pen slowed. She closed the notebook halfway, keeping one finger in the seam, and glanced up just as he began to walk toward her booth. He didn't ask permission. He slid into the seat across from her with the ease of someone who had already decided he belonged there. From inside his jacket, he pulled a small, black leather wallet. He opened it and laid it flat on the table between them. A federal badge caught the weak diner light, gleaming against the scuffed formica. His voice was low, deliberate, and without introduction. "You're not here by accident, Lawson, and neither am I." 5. The return of an old ally. 1,350 words. The badge lay between them, glinting under the diner's buzzing fluorescent light. Its shine didn't fade when she met his eyes. The same sharp, knowing green she remembered from years ago. Isaac Rourke hadn't changed in the way that mattered. "Still drinking coffee you don't touch," he said, glancing at her cup. His voice was low, deliberate, and threaded with something between relief and caution. Kendra leaned back in the booth, studying him. "I thought you were running ops in Eastern Europe." "I was," he said simply, folding the badge closed and sliding it back into his jacket. Until Charleston came knocking. The last time she'd seen him, they'd been in a motel room off I-95, her cover half burned, his voice calm as he guided her through an exit plan. He'd told her then to stay dark, stay local, and only re-emerge if it mattered. Seeing him here meant it mattered. "I assume you're not here for the pie," she said. Isaac's mouth tilted in the smallest smirk. But his eyes didn't soften. "Morrissey and Keller," he began, "are on our radar, not just for what they did to you today. The Bureau's been building a case for over a year. Bribery, falsified reports, protection rackets with certain judges, but the problem with men like them is, they don't move unless they think they're untouchable. Her fingers tapped once on the closed leather notebook in front of her, and humiliating me in open court makes them feel untouchable. Exactly. Isaac leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. What they don't know is that your case, small as it looks, is the thread we can pull. You're not just a victim here, Kendra. You're the pressure point. The weight of his words sank in. She'd been seeing this as a personal vendetta, a targeted humiliation meant to bruise her and keep her quiet. Now she could see the wider frame, a network of systemic abuse stretching far beyond her traffic stop. This wasn't just about two officers with a grudge. This was about the machinery that allowed them to operate without consequence. She let out a slow breath. And you want me to play along? Let them think they're winning. Isaac's gaze didn't waver. I'm telling you that if you push this, you'll be bait. But you'll also be the fuse. It was the kind of line he'd used before on deep cover assignments. The moment where he offered both a warning and a challenge, letting her choose whether to step forward. She thought back to her time under him. The long stakeouts, the quiet manipulations, the careful dismantling of criminal networks from the inside out. Back then, it had been about strangers. Now the target had her name in their mouths, and her life in their crosshairs. And if I refuse, she asked, then you walk out of here tonight, and they keep doing this to the next person. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month. But it'll happen, and they'll remember that they got you. The truth stung because she'd already known it. Isaac reached into his jacket again, and pulled out a thick manila envelope, its flap sealed tight with a strip of black tape. He set it down gently between them. This, he said, tapping it once with his forefinger, isn't for you to read tonight. It's for tomorrow, in court. When the time's right, you open it. And you do not, under any circumstances, let them see you hesitate. Her hand hovered over the envelope but didn't touch it yet.
What's in it?
He gave a small shake of his head. Need to know. And right now, you don't. If you knew, it would change your behavior. They'd smell it. And if they smell it, this whole thing dies before it starts. Kendra studied him. He looked older, but not in the way most men aged. Isaac's kind of aging was like a sharpened blade, leaner, harder, honed by use. His hair had more gray at the temples now, but his posture was still that of a man who could vanish into a crowd in seconds. What's the Bureau's endgame, she asked. To cut the head off the network. Not just these two officers, but the judge, the prosecutor, the clerks, everyone who's been feeding this machine, and I'm supposed to be the bait. You're supposed to be the spark, he corrected. We'll handle the fire. Her coffee had gone cold, but she took a sip anyway, letting the bitterness settle on her tongue. You ever think about what it costs to be the spark, Isaac? He met her question without flinching. Every day. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the fridge behind the counter filling the space between them. The waitress returned briefly, dropping off the check without a word. Finally, Kendra reached out and slid the envelope toward her side of the booth. The black tape felt rough under her fingertips. Tomorrow, she said. Isaac nodded once. Tomorrow. He stood to leave, but before turning toward the door, he leaned down, close enough that his words reached only her. One more thing. They're not all against you. Watch the jury. Someone in that box isn't what they seem. Her brow furrowed. Which one? You'll know when it matters. And then he was gone, slipping out the door into the warm Charleston night without drawing a single glance from the remaining diners. Kendra stayed in the booth a few minutes longer, her mind running through the day in a new light. She thought about Morrissey's fleeting fear in court, about Keller's forced grin, about the way the judge's tone had faltered. This was no longer about her name being cleared. It was about dismantling something that had been thriving in plain sight for years. She wasn't just defending herself, she was stepping onto the front line of a war most people didn't even know was being fought. She slid the envelope into her bag and left the diner, the bell over the door jingling softly behind her. Outside, the street was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of magnolia. She started walking toward the busier part of town, staying alert but not hurried. In her peripheral vision, she caught the reflection of movement, the same dark SUV from earlier creeping along the curb half a block back. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. No name. Just a text. They know you met him. Kendra's grip tightened on the strap of her bag. Tomorrow hadn't even come yet, and already the game had shifted. And now, she had no way of knowing who was truly watching. The gavel hovered, a dark pendulum about to choose its path, when Kendra's phone lit her palm with an electric whisper. "They're not ready for who you really are." The words didn't shout. They tightened the room, narrowed the air, made the wood grain on the bench in front of her look like a map of escape routes. She didn't blink. She couldn't. A single sentence dragged a hidden life into the center of this crowded room, into the space between her pulse and the judge's breath. Only one person ever used that phrasing. Only one had taught her to hear the unsaid inside ordinary sentences. Isaac Rourke. Back then, he wore threadbare suits and never ordered the same coffee twice. A man who could become background in any room and convince you he'd never been there. When you need to pivot, he used to say, "Don't run. Change the story you appear to be in." Her gaze stayed lowered to avoid the bailiff's line of sight. The message shimmered like a horizon. "Miss Lawson," the judge intoned. "This court." His baritone rolled forward, and she slipped her phone beneath a yellow legal pad, her thumb flicking to the keyboard. A reply blinked from the center of her chest to the tip of her finger. "Name the room." She didn't send it. Not yet. Instead, she let the words sit unsent, like a breath held underwater. Calm was discipline. Discipline was survival. And survival was an old talent she'd learned long before badges and codes and safe houses, with numbers instead of addresses. That talent was born in red dirt. Rural Alabama, where her grandmother scrubbed porches that weren't her own and carried dignity like a lantern through rooms that tried to snuff it out. Kendra learned the routes to school that had fewer Confederate flags, learned which cashier would count her change slow like a lesson. At 12, she won the county science fair and stood on a cafeteria stage while a judge praised her surprising result, as if her mind were a coin trick. She smiled then, filed the word away, made a list of every door that creaked when opened. At 14, a neighbor boy's pickup truck lost its brakes beside her. The hood lurched, paint scraping her knee, and he laughed through the apology. She went home and diagrammed the street, the slope, the angles, how bodies move when intention masquerades as accident. She watched, she catalogued. Quiet observation tasted like power. A teacher slipped her a battered world atlas and a whispered encouragement. "Get out, Kendra. Go far enough that you can see this place from space." She took that map into her pillow at night and traced exit lines like lifelines. The Air Force wasn't a poster on a hallway wall for her. It was a door propped open by hurry. She sat across from a recruiter who asked, "You sure you want intel, not medical, not logistics?" She answered, "I want where silence gets loud." Basic training sanded her edges, but it didn't smooth away her history. It gave her a frame to hold it. She learned Arabic verbs by rhythm and Russian consonants by the way they pushed at her teeth. She learned patience the way you learn a coastline, one tide at a time. In the intelligence division, she met rooms full of screens and people who confused jargon for truth. She learned to thread a radio's hiss into sentences and pull a confession from the shape of a pause. An instructor with scarred knuckles taught counter-surveillance by leading them in circles through Baltimore until they forgot the original street. "Your eyes are good," he told her once. Not as praise but as a fact, the way weather is a fact. She logged a compliment and turned it into a standard she refused to drop below. There were missions that left no photographs in the unit archives. She sat in unmarked cars and memorized the way a corrupt official touched his tie each time he lied. She was the only black woman in too many rooms, the kind where someone would say "you people" without knowing they'd said anything at all. When promotions came, they came slower. When mistakes happened, they landed louder. She swallowed every sting and converted it to data, to habit, to a refusal to let other people's ceilings become her roofline. In those years, Isaac appeared, first as a rumor, then as a shadow that knew her name. He was a handler who disliked the word, a strategist who loved subplots. "We don't break chains by yanking," he'd murmur. "We loosen the links until they forget they ever fit." Under him, Kendra learned the seams of domestic corruption, which court clerks changed dates, which cops logged traffic stops as furtive behavior, which city contracts circled back to cousins and golf partners. He gave her a new alias, with a driver's license that looked handmade by God. When she asked the mission, he said, "You'll know it when the wrong men laugh too loudly." Civilian life rushed at her like a game show set. New job, new lease, a planted past. She became the kind of neighbor who waved from the mailbox and paid on time. The kind of woman the HOA couldn't complain about, because she preempted every rule. Under the surface, she stepped into courthouse hallways and precinct lobbies, listening to how stories got arranged to absolve the storytellers. The work was a braid of boredom, enlightening. Then a year that should have been ordinary turned surgical. An asset vanished. A judge closed a door he swore wasn't there. Isaac told her to go still, off-grid still, the kind of still that makes friends stop calling. So she disappeared. She learned the routes to the farmer's market, the times to avoid the coffee shop conversations that turned racial within 3 sentences. She adopted routines that made her invisible and allowed the city to believe she belonged to it without ever noticing she did. Charleston gave her beauty and warning in equal measure. The marsh glare on afternoon water, the steam of bias rising off asphalt after rain. She had promised herself she wouldn't reactivate unless the stakes were larger than her name. Today they were. The message wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. Back in the courtroom's present, she considered risk the way other people considered lunch options. Respond, and she announced to anyone monitoring the cell tower that she still had a network. Don't respond, and she lost the only leverage that understood this room better than she did. She slid the phone an inch beneath the pad, felt the wood's cool edge against her wrist, and typed with the fettiness that had once calibrated drones. Name the room. She still didn't send. She glanced up. The court reporter's fingers clattered, then faltered, tapping out a rhythm that pricked her memory. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Not SOS. A variation, a question. Her public defender leaned toward her, whispering into the charged space between them. They're railroading us, he said, fear nicking his words. I can appeal to gag stuff later, but she shook her head. A slight movement, and the young lawyer blinked, upset by the calm he mistook for surrender. Behind him, Morrissey grinned in a way that asked for witnesses. Keller breathed laughter through his nose. The gallery absorbed their performance the way a sponge takes stain, without resistance, with the promise of permanence. Somewhere a camera hissed. Somewhere else, a pen scratched the word defiant. Kendra scanned the jury box as if it were a hillside. She'd be asked to cross at dusk. Juror 2 had a sweatshirt tied around his waist like a tourniquet. Juror 5 had a blue pen stain on her cuff. Juror 9, a man in his late 30s with close-cropped hair and a suit that fit well enough to have been chosen by a partner who cared. At his lapel a tiny pin, a silver heron, memory pressed against her ribs. In a training manual once, a sketch beside a paragraph about silent identifiers, birds used by different units to mark who wouldn't betray whom. Herons meant patience. Herons meant wait. The judge lifted the sentencing sheet, eyes coasting over the ink, as if it were a weather report. Kendra breathed in the dust of benches, and clove gum, and old varnish. She tapped the phone screen awake with her thumb, and hovered over send, the way a diver toes the cliff's lip before choosing descent. The court reporter cleared her throat. The bailiff adjusted his belt. 2 seats over from Juror 9, a woman dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue she didn't need. Time layered itself, past on present, training on trial, until the room felt like glass she could press a finger against and leave no print. Her phone buzzed again, almost soundless on the soft pad of paper. A second message stacked beneath the first. Don't send. Eyes on you. The letters stung with familiarity, with someone watching her watch them. She slid the device deeper into shadow and lifted her chin a fraction, enough to meet the air at its own level. Above the prosecution table, a courthouse clock ticked with fussy sincerity. Each second sounded like a footstep down a hall she couldn't yet see. Miss Lawson, the judge said, savoring the pause. This court finds, his words elongated like taffy, in summer heat. Kendra inhaled quiet. She let her gaze move, unhurried, toward Juror 9, the man with the silver heron. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at her, directly. The room slid into a narrower frame. The pen in his right hand stilled. His mouth formed a line, then loosened. He shaped 2 words without sound, deliberate as handwriting taught by a careful mother. We know. The black tape gave way with a sound that seemed too loud for her kitchen. Kendra peeled it back slowly, keeping the flap of the manila envelope flat against the table so nothing spilled. The air in the room felt different, as if the act of opening it had changed the weight of the night. Inside she found 3 items: a stack of glossy photographs, a bundle of printed bank statements, and a small square digital recorder. No instructions, no explanations, just evidence that hummed with quiet danger. She picked up the photographs first. The first few were mundane enough to almost be boring. Morrissey in street clothes, leaving a bar, Keller at a backyard cookout, but the 4th photo pulled the air from her lungs. It was a grainy shot, clearly taken at night, of Morrissey standing beside a black sedan, with its passenger door open. A young man slumped halfway out of the car, his face blurred in motion, one hand on the pavement. The timestamp was from 2 years ago. She didn't need to know the name to recognize the posture of someone barely conscious, or worse. The next photo was sharper. Morrissey slipping an envelope of cash into the hand of a man in a suit outside a warehouse. She didn't recognize the man, but she didn't have to. The context was plain. The bank statements were worse. Transactions to shell accounts, withdrawals that lined up perfectly with court dates, money moving in amounts just small enough to avoid automatic reporting, yet large enough to bend someone's loyalty in half. Her hands hovered over the recorder before she pressed play. A burst of static, then voices, muffled at first, then clearer. Morrissey's drawl came through, casual, cruel. You don't press charges, you don't say a word, and your little boy keeps breathing. We understand each other. A pause. A voice she didn't recognize answered, shaking. Yes. The silence after that answer was worse than the words. She clicked it off. The evidence was nuclear. If dropped in court at the wrong moment, it could vaporize Morrissey and Keller's careers, maybe their freedom, but it could also tip them off, make them burn other connections before the Bureau could trace them. Isaac had been right. Timing wasn't just important. It was everything. Kendra sat back, the edges of the photograph still warm from her hands. She thought of her grandmother's voice, deep and steady. Sometimes you don't fight for yourself, baby. Sometimes you fight so they can't do it to the next one. She folded everything back into the envelope and slipped it into her bag. That night, she didn't sleep. Every sound outside her window, the low thrum of a passing car, the creak of a settling porch beam, made her eyes flick open. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. They would escalate if they thought she had nothing. They would escalate faster if they suspected she had something. By morning, she had chosen her approach. The evidence would come with her to court, not locked away in a safe, not hidden in her apartment, with her. The courthouse steps felt steeper than usual, the morning air heavy with humidity. Television cameras were set up on the sidewalk, their cords snaking like roots toward portable lights. A few reporters called her name, but she kept moving. Inside, she could hear them before she saw them. Morrissey and Keller, laughing near the security checkpoint. The sound was familiar, but this morning, it carried something else beneath it. She caught it in the way Morrissey's glance slid toward her bag, and away again, too quickly, in the way Keller's smile faltered for half a breath before returning to its default smirk. They knew she was carrying something. They just didn't know what. The thought almost made her smile. She moved through the metal detector, the envelope tucked flat against the inner lining of her bag. The bailiff who checked her things looked a beat too long at the manila edge, but didn't touch it. She thanked him without warmth and kept walking. Her attorney was waiting near the defense table, leaning toward her as she approached. You look ready, he said cautiously. I am, she answered. She didn't elaborate. The morning session began with routine motions, the kind of legal back and forth that lulled jurors into boredom. Kendra sat, listening without reacting, the weight of the envelope a steady reminder against her hip. Every now and then, she let her gaze drift to the jury box, scanning for the man Isaac had hinted at. Juror 9 met her eyes once, briefly, and looked away. Midway through the proceedings, the judge adjusted his glasses and called for the next witness. Then his gaze shifted to her. Miss Lawson, please take the stand. She rose, the wood of the chair legs scraping against the floor. The courtroom air felt denser, as though everyone had collectively decided to breathe less. She walked the length of the aisle, the click of her shoes echoing. As she approached the witness stand, the bailiff stepped close enough that she could feel the heat from his shoulder. His face was impassive, but his voice was low, meant only for her. The jury will never hear a word you say. The words slid under her skin, colder than any insult Morrissey had thrown at her. It wasn't a threat shouted in anger. It was a statement of fact, delivered like a reminder of her place. She paused at the stand, her hand hovering over the Bible. Her attorney's eyes were on her, questioning, but she didn't look back. If the jury wasn't going to hear her, then her plan needed to change. Now, the envelope in her bag suddenly felt like a live wire, and in the corner of her vision, she saw Morrissey watching, his smile faint but his eyes locked on her, every move. Kendra swore in, her voice steady, but in her mind she was already rearranging the battlefield. If they thought they could silence her, they had no idea what she was about to do next. The Bible was still warm in her palm when the judge cleared his throat in a way that made the courtroom hush instantly. Before we proceed with testimony, he said, adjusting his glasses with deliberate slowness, I am issuing a procedural gag order regarding any and all unsubstantiated claims of misconduct by law enforcement. The words landed in the air like a steel door slamming shut. Her attorney stiffened beside her, his lips parting in protest, but the judge raised one hand without looking at him. This is to preserve the integrity of the proceedings, he continued, and to ensure the jury is not swayed by irrelevant or prejudicial statements. Irrelevant. Prejudicial. The phrasing was surgical, and it cut exactly where it was intended to, right through her ability to say aloud what was in the envelope. Pressed against her hip, Kendra didn't look at the judge. She didn't have to. She could feel the weight of the coordination, the way this order had been decided before she even set foot in the courtroom this morning. This wasn't about integrity, it was about containment. She swept her eyes across the room, letting her gaze land briefly on each player. Morrissey leaned back in his chair, the smirk he'd worn yesterday replaced with something cooler, more satisfied. Keller sat forward, elbows on the table, as if anticipating a show he now knew wouldn't happen. And then she saw them, two men in the gallery, dressed in plain button-down shirts and slacks. Their posture was wrong for casual observers. Too upright, too still. One kept his hands folded in front of him. The other's foot tapped a steady, controlled rhythm that wasn't impatience. It was habit. They weren't there for the trial. They were there for her. Isaac's voice flickered through her mind, low and certain. They'll box you in. You have to make them overplay their hand. Well, the box was closing. The question was whether she'd let them believe it had worked. Her attorney leaned toward her, whispering, "We can challenge this, but the appeal process is too slow," she finished for him, her voice low but even. She didn't take her eyes off the gallery. "They want me to react now. I'm not giving them that." The judge nodded to the bailiff, who motioned for her to be seated. She returned to the defense table, the envelope still resting against her side like a loaded weapon she couldn't draw. Not yet. As the prosecution resumed its careful, sanitized questioning of witnesses, Kendra adjusted her breathing, slowing her pulse. She knew how this game worked. In covert operations, the loudest noise often came from the wrong direction. The fight wasn't going to be won through open statements now. It would be fought in the shadows, between the lines, in the places where the official transcript would never go. When the prosecution's second witness stepped down, she caught a flicker of movement in the gallery. One of the plainclothes men leaned toward the other, murmured something. Then both of them stood and walked out in unison. She didn't need to guess who they were reporting to. The morning session crawled on, every question and answer coated in the polite varnish of legal procedure. But beneath the surface, she could feel the tension tightening. Morrissey no longer looked like a man savoring an easy win. He looked like someone checking the clock too often, calculating how much longer he had before something shifted. By the time the judge called a recess for lunch, the courtroom air felt heavy, like the seconds before a summer storm when you could taste the change on your tongue. The jurors filed out, avoiding her gaze. Keller stood and stretched in an exaggerated show of comfort, while Morrissey leaned down to whisper something to Calhoun, the prosecutor, who nodded without looking up. Kendra gathered her bag slowly, giving herself a moment to think. Every move from this point forward had to be deliberate. She would have to provoke them without stepping outside the very rules they'd just tightened around her neck. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She slid it out discreetly, her body angled away from the nearest bailiff. The message was from an unknown number. No name, no photo, just a single sentence. "They're coming for you tonight." Her fingers tightened around the phone. She didn't look up right away. She just let the words settle, the way Isaac had taught her to let new intel sit before reacting. When she finally did glance across the room, she found Morrissey watching her, not smiling this time, but studying. If he had sent the message, he wouldn't be watching for a reaction. He'd be waiting for a result. Which meant someone else had sent it. Someone close enough to know the plan, but far enough to want her alive to hear it. She dropped the phone back into her bag and stood, her expression unchanged. Whatever was coming tonight, she would be ready for it. As she stepped into the hallway, she caught sight of the two plainclothes men again. Only now they weren't in the gallery. They were standing just outside the courthouse doors, waiting. The elevator ride to her floor was silent except for the hum of the old machinery. The courthouse still clung to her. The judge's manufactured gag order, the way the plainclothes men had tracked her out the doors. But the moment the elevator doors slid open, a different weight settled in her chest. The hallway was dim, one flickering bulb casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Her apartment door looked exactly as she had left it that morning, But her gut told her otherwise. Kendra had learned early in life to trust that feeling, the whisper in her bones that something had shifted when no one else could see it. She slid the key into the lock, turned it slowly, and stepped inside. At first glance, nothing was wrong. The blinds were half drawn, the couch sat in its usual corner, and the small dining table bore the same unopened mail pile. But her eyes went to the details. The small picture frame on the shelf near the kitchen, tilted just slightly left instead of perfectly square, the faint trace of sandalwood cologne in the air, one she didn't wear and no one in her building used. The coat rack's hooks uneven, as if someone had brushed past them. She closed the door without sound, her bag still on her shoulder, and let her eyes travel the perimeter of the room. Every movement was slow, deliberate. Through the reflection in the window, she caught it, the dull glint of headlights down the street. A black SUV, parked just far enough to be non-threatening but close enough to have a clear line of sight into her apartment windows. The engine idled, visible in the faint exhaust drifting into the humid night air. Kendra let her bag slide onto the couch and moved toward the hallway. She kept her footsteps soft, listening for the floorboard creak that would tell her someone had been careless. In the bedroom, nothing looked out of place, until she tilted her head back and saw the smoke detector. It was newer than it should have been. She'd lived here 3 years. She knew every scratch, every paint bubble. This one was smooth, pristine, and its tiny LED didn't blink. She fetched a chair from the kitchen, placed it directly beneath the detector, and climbed up. Her fingers brushed the edge, and felt the faintest seam that shouldn't be there. A quick twist, and the plastic cover came free. Inside, tucked alongside the battery, was a small black microphone. Her first instinct was to pull it out, crush it in her palm, and throw it in the trash. Instead, she smiled, not for herself, but for whoever was listening. She replaced the cover, stepped down from the chair, and set it back at the table. Then she began to speak. She walked through the apartment, her voice casual, like she was on the phone with a friend. "Yeah, I think they're right," she said to no one. "I don't have anything. The case will be over soon. I'll probably just leave town for a while, maybe longer." Her tone was light, almost resigned. She made sure her footsteps echoed in different parts of the apartment, pausing as though she were considering something she didn't want to say out loud. Through the window's reflection, she saw it, the SUV's brake lights flickering to life. Within a minute, it rolled away. In its place, 2 squad cars appeared at the end of the block, cruising slowly past her building. They didn't stop. They didn't need to. Their message was clear. "We're still here." She moved to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. Her mind was already working 3 steps ahead. If they'd gone to the trouble of planting a microphone, they'd been inside before, maybe more than once. The intrusion wasn't just about gathering intel. It was about reminding her they could touch every corner of her life without leaving fingerprints. It was a tactic she'd seen before in other cities, against other people, mostly those without the resources or the voice to fight back. The humiliation, the intrusion, the psychological pressure, all meant to make the target crumble quietly. She wouldn't crumble. The squad cars circled the block again, their headlights briefly sweeping across her living room, before fading. She set the water down and went to her desk, pulling open the top drawer to check something. The thin strip of clear tape she'd placed on the inside edge a week ago was torn. Someone had opened it. Whatever they'd been looking for, they hadn't found it. Which meant they'd be back. A sharp knock at the door jolted the air in the apartment. Not the casual rap of a neighbor. Not the heavy pound of police. 3 knocks. A pause. 2 more. Her body went still. That pattern meant something. Not a signal she'd used herself, but one she'd heard in briefing rooms before. It meant urgency without volume. She moved to the door quietly, standing to the side in case someone on the other side was watching through the peephole. "Kendra." The voice was low, trembling. Her stomach tightened. It wasn't Isaac. It wasn't anyone from her old bureau days. It was her younger brother, Marcus. "They made me choose between you and my job." Her hand froze on the deadbolt, the weight of his words hanging heavier than the silence that followed. Outside, the squad cars idled, waiting. Kendra unlatched the deadbolt and eased the door open, half expecting to see shadows waiting in the hallway. Instead, Marcus stood there in full uniform, his hat tucked under one arm, sweat tracing a line down his temple. His eyes darted past her shoulder into the apartment before landing back on her. "You alone?" he asked. "Yes," she said slowly, scanning his face. "Why?" He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. shutting the door with more force than necessary. The tension in his shoulders was obvious. This wasn't a casual visit. "They think you're a mole," he said, the words spilling out before he could soften them. Kendra's pulse didn't spike. Years of fieldwork had trained her to absorb the impact of information before showing a reaction. But the word mole landed heavy. It wasn't just an accusation, it was a label that carried weight in a police department. Once it stuck, it didn't wash off. "Who's they?" she asked. Marcus looked down at the hat in his hands, twisting it once before answering. "Everyone who matters." The whisper started after your first court date. "They say you've been working with the feds for years, taking down departments from the inside." Her mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Sounds like they've been reading bad crime novels." He didn't return the expression. "They want me to give them whatever I can. Personal stuff. Where you go. Who you talk to. Anything they can use to get ahead of you." She studied him for a long moment. "And you came here to warn me?" "I came here because I didn't say yes," he said, "but I didn't say no either." That, more than the words themselves, stung. Family loyalty was supposed to be unquestioned, unshakable. She could take the laughter of strangers, the arrogance of corrupt cops, but this was different. This was her brother standing in her living room, wearing the badge of the same system that was trying to crush her, confessing he'd been asked to help them do it. "I don't want to lose my job, Kendra," Marcus continued, his voice lower now. "I'm on probation as a rookie. One wrong move and I'm done. They'll make sure no other department touches me." She took a slow step closer. "And if you help them, you keep your job? That's the deal?" His eyes flickered. "It's not a deal. It's survival." Kendra recognized the fear in him, the kind that doesn't come from immediate danger, but from knowing the walls around you belong to someone else, and they can close them whenever they want. She'd seen it in witnesses, in informants, even in fellow agents who got too close to the wrong truth. "They're using you as a pawn," she said quietly. "And pawns don't last long on the board, Marcus. You know that." He swallowed hard. "So what do I do?" She didn't hesitate. "You give them something." His head jerked up.
What?
"Not the truth," she said. "Pieces that look valuable but lead nowhere. I'll tell you exactly what to say, and it'll be enough to make them think you're playing along. But it will keep you clean." Marcus hesitated. "And if they figure it out, then they'll treat you like they treat everyone else who's disposable," she said, her voice flat. "But right now the bigger risk is them thinking you're loyal to me." For a few moments, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then Marcus nodded once. "What do you want me to tell them?" She crossed to her desk, opened the leather notebook, and flipped to a fresh page. She began writing, her handwriting quick but precise. Harmless details, fabricated meetings with non-existent people, and a few plans that would burn time and resources if they tried to follow them. When she finished, she tore the page free and folded it twice before handing it to him. "Commit it to memory. Destroy it when you're done." Marcus took the paper like it was heavier than it should be. He slid it into his jacket pocket and exhaled slowly. "You think this will work?" "I think it'll buy us time," she said. He lingered a moment longer, looking like he wanted to say something else, then just nodded and left. Kendra locked the door behind him and stood there, staring at the wood grain. The conversation had given her more than she admitted out loud, not just confirmation of the whispers, but proof that her fight was now brushing against her family in ways she couldn't fully control. She didn't sleep that night, her mind replaying Marcus's expression over and over. The fear was there, yes, but so was something else: resignation. He'd already accepted that his career was a leash someone else held. It was past midnight when her phone buzzed. Not a call, just a news alert from the local feed. At first she thought she was imagining it. Abandoned squad car found on West Side Industrial Road. Officer unaccounted for. She clicked a link. The grainy photo showed Marcus's unit number on the side of the car. The doors were open, the headlights still on, and the radio microphone was dangling out the driver's side, swinging in the breeze. According to the brief statement, the mic had been transmitting a single phrase on loop. When officers arrived, no one would confirm what it was. But a minute later, her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an unlisted number. It kept saying, "She knows everything." Kendra sat back in her chair, the words burning into her vision. If Marcus hadn't said them, someone had made sure the world thought he did. The morning news confirmed what the text had already told her. Marcus was missing. The anchor's voice was crisp and sterile. reading from the teleprompter as if she were listing weekend weather patterns. Officer Marcus Lawson has been reported missing after his patrol car was found abandoned in the West Side Industrial District late last night. The investigation is ongoing. No mention of the repeated phrase. No acknowledgement that the message was aimed at her. Kendra stood in her kitchen, the mug of untouched coffee cooling in her hand. She'd been in this kind of moment before, when an operation went sideways, and you didn't know if your missing contact was a casualty, a traitor, or bait. The difference this time was blood. This time it was her brother. This wasn't a random disappearance. The location, the abandoned vehicle, the radio message. It was all too precise. This was a performance, staged for her. She set the coffee down and went to the small metal lockbox in her closet. The manila envelope was inside, exactly where she'd left it. She laid its contents out on the table again. But this time she looked for something different. Not just proof of corruption, a pattern. Her eyes caught on the bank statements first. Several withdrawals aligned with rental payments to a private storage facility near the docks. The amounts were consistent, just under the threshold for triggering financial reporting, and always followed by cash deposits into personal accounts belonging to either Morrissey or one of his known associates. She didn't know what was in that facility, but she knew the docks were the kind of place where paper trails went to die. If Marcus was being used as leverage, the docks would be the kind of ground the people holding him felt comfortable on. By nightfall, she was moving. No calls, no backup, just the quiet rhythm of preparation. Black clothing, gloves, a slim LED flashlight, and the compact lockpick set she hadn't touched in years. The docks at night had their own kind of silence. Not empty but expectant. The creak of ropes in the breeze. The slap of water against hulls. The occasional clang of metal. The storage facility was a long, low building, with corrugated steel walls and a single line of sodium lights humming overhead. Kendra kept to the shadows, moving along the fence until she found the blind spot between two cameras. The lock on the side gate was standard issue. Cheap, easy to bypass. Within 30 seconds, she was inside. The units were arranged in two long rows, their rolling doors painted in peeling blue. She moved past the first few, scanning the numbers until she found the one that matched the payment ID from Morrissey's statement. It took a little longer to open. When the door finally rolled up, the smell hit her first: damp paper, dust, and something metallic. Inside, stacks of cardboard boxes lined the walls. She crouched and began checking them, working quickly but methodically. The first box was filled with case files, all unfiled, some going back more than a decade. She flipped one open. Assault, unsolved. Victim's name redacted. Location, a block from her grandmother's old house. Another file. Evidence, not logged. Photographs of seized cash, drugs, even weapons, none of it tagged for storage. And then she saw it. Marcus's badge. It was lying on top of a smaller stack of files, the gold catching the faint light from her flashlight. Her stomach tightened as she reached for it. The badge was still warm from being handled recently. Underneath was a case file marked simply Jane. She opened it and froze. The description was hers. Not exactly. The age was off by a year. The hair color listed as light brown, instead of black. But the height, the scar on her left wrist, even the street where she'd been last seen, matched a night she remembered all too well. Back then, she'd chalked it up to a run-of-the-mill stop-and-question incident that ended when the officers lost interest. But now she was staring at proof they'd cataloged her as a subject of interest over a decade ago. They'd been tracking her long before her current case, long before she'd met Isaac. Her mind raced. That meant this wasn't just about silencing her now. This was the continuation of something that had started years earlier. She'd been in their files all along. A floorboard creaked behind her. She swung around, the flashlight beam slicing through the dark and hitting another beam coming straight at her. The second light was blinding, forcing her to raise a hand. A voice came from behind it, low and calm but edged with authority. "You have 2 minutes to decide if you walk out of here alive." The beam didn't waver, and in its glare she couldn't see the face, only the faint outline of someone who already knew exactly what she'd found. The flashlight beam stayed fixed on her, the glare turning the dust in the storage unit into floating sparks. Kendra kept her breathing steady, her body angled just enough to keep her right hand near the side pocket of her bag. Then the light dipped, revealing a face. "Special Agent Marisol Vega," the woman said, flipping the flashlight to her other hand and pulling out a badge with her free one. The small embossed seal caught the faint light. And if you're as smart as Isaac says, you'll put that folder down before you get us both killed. Kendra didn't move right away. You've been following me. Marisol stepped inside the unit, closing the door behind her. Not you, specifically. The network. You just walked into the middle of it. Her tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the clipped cadence of someone who knew the walls had ears. Kendra set the Jane Doe file back on the stack, but didn't release it entirely. Isaac didn't mention you. He wouldn't, Marisol replied. Separate ops. I've been under for 9 months on a different case. Human trafficking tied to the same people your boys Morrissey and Keller work for. Kendra's eyes narrowed. And you're just now making contact? Marisol's gaze swept the unit. Until tonight, you didn't need to know I existed. But your brother's disappearance changed the timetable. He's not just leverage anymore. He's a liability to them, and to us, if he talks in the wrong ear. The knot in Kendra's chest tightened. So you know where he is? Marisol hesitated. Just enough to make the air between them heavy. Not yet, but I know where they'll take him if they don't get what they want from you. And I know what happens to people in that place. Kendra absorbed that without flinching, her mind cataloging the possibilities. You've been monitoring the case. Then you know the gag order they slapped on me this morning wasn't about trial integrity. Marisol nodded. It's containment. They're scared of what you've got, and they're trying to make sure you can't pass it through official channels before they shut you down. Kendra glanced at the envelope in her bag. They already know I'm carrying something. They just don't know how much of it I understand. Good, Marisol said. That's leverage, as long as you don't let them realize you've connected the dots. They both fell silent for a moment. The distant hum of a ship's engine outside the only sound. Finally, Kendra broke it. Walk me through it. Start with Marcus. Marisol crouched beside a crate, speaking low. Their brother's rookie status makes him perfect for them. No established power base. No one to protect him if he gets caught doing something dirty. They likely pressured him for intel on you. When he didn't deliver what they wanted, they staged his disappearance as a warning to both of you. Kendra's jaw set. They staged it in a way that made it look like he pointed the finger at me. Exactly, Marisol said. Classic misdirection. They discredit you, disarm him, and keep everyone guessing about his loyalty. Meanwhile, they tighten the net. Kendra looked around the unit again. The unfiled reports, the hidden evidence, her brother's badge. And this place? Marisol's expression hardened. It's a dump site for anything that could burn them in court. Unlogged evidence. Cold case files they never intended to solve. Proof of payoffs. I've been looking for it for months. You just found it on your first night out here. Kendra allowed herself a thin smile. Occupational habit. Marisol straightened. Listen to me. The courtroom isn't your biggest problem. The real threat is the network holding it together. Judges, officers, prosecutors, all bound by shared crimes. You take down one piece without the others, and the rest will bury you before you can stand back up. The words didn't surprise Kendra. She'd seen it before. Small-town alliances that were anything but small. The trick wasn't exposing the rot. It was exposing it in a way that prevented the rest from walling it off and surviving. Then I need to hit them all at once, Kendra said quietly. Marisol gave her a sharp look. That's not a solo job. It wasn't meant to be, Kendra replied. Not if Isaac's playing the long game I think he is. Marisol's lips curved faintly. Maybe you are as smart as he says. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small matte black phone. No branding, no markings. You're going to need this. Encrypted. One way. It'll ring only if I call you. Or if Isaac does. Kendra took it, feeling the unexpected weight of the device. Don't keep it with your regular phone, Marisol added, and don't call anyone from it unless you want them in a body bag by morning. The seriousness in her tone wasn't for effect. Kendra slipped the phone into a separate pocket in her bag. What's my next move? Marisol didn't answer immediately. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. Get back to court tomorrow like nothing happened. Hold the evidence. Make them think you're still boxed in. I'll work on Marcus from my end. There was something in her tone, a flicker of urgency, maybe even warning, but before Kendra could press, the burner phone in her bag vibrated. Once, twice. She pulled it out, frowning. You did. It's not me, Marisol said. Kendra swiped to answer. The line crackled. Then a voice came through, strained and urgent. Kendra. Her stomach dropped. Marcus? There was a pause, the sound of someone breathing hard on the other end. Don't trust her. The call went dead. leaving Kendra standing in the cold storage unit, the burner phone still warm in her hand, and Marisol watching her with eyes she suddenly couldn't read. The courthouse steps were lined with cameras when Kendra arrived the next morning. The air was heavy with the restless hum of reporters jostling for position, their lenses tracking her every movement. Someone had leaked the idea that her case was tied to a federal probe, and the media could smell blood in the veer. She didn't stop for questions, but she noticed the shift in the crowd. Yesterday, the press had looked at her like she was just another defendant in an unremarkable local case. Today, their eyes were sharper, curious, as if they were trying to figure out whether she was a victim, a threat, or the kind of story that could win awards. Inside the courtroom, the change in atmosphere was even more pronounced. The low hum of conversation among the gallery stopped when she entered. At the prosecution table, Morrissey sat rigid, his smirk replaced with something colder. Keller, who had once leaned back in his chair like he owned the room, now kept his gaze fixed on a folder in front of him, never looking her way. Even Calhoun, the prosecutor, had lost some of the swagger in his stride, flipping through his notes too quickly, as if searching for a page that might make him feel in control again. Kendra took her seat beside her attorney, sliding her bag under the table. The manila envelope inside seemed to pulse against her leg. The judge entered, his gavel tapping once. "Let's proceed." But instead of continuing with the witness list, Calhoun stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, given the limited scope of the charges and the evidence already presented, the state moves to proceed directly to closing arguments." It was a transparent attempt to cut off any remaining testimonies, especially those that could damage his case. Her attorney rose. "Objection, Your Honor. We still have multiple witnesses prepared to testify to." The judge cut him off. "Mr. Calhoun, this is highly irregular." "Perhaps," the prosecutor said, "but it is in the interest of judicial efficiency." Kendra could feel the tension ratcheting up with each exchange. Efficiency was the exact word they used when they wanted to bury something quickly and without ceremony. She leaned slightly toward her attorney. "Let him try. Just stall him." As the arguments over procedure played out, Kendra slipped the envelope from her bag and onto her lap. With her other hand, she slid her phone toward the edge of the table, opening a text thread with a single contact, a court clerk she'd spoken to briefly on the first day of the trial. The woman had been professional but human, her eyes showing flickers of something like sympathy, when Kendra had testified. When her attorney's voice rose in a particularly forceful objection, Kendra took the moment to stand, excusing herself to the clerk's desk with the casual air of someone requesting a document. She leaned forward, keeping her voice low. "I need this delivered to an address. No return name. No questions. If you can't do it, say so now." The clerk glanced down at the envelope, then back up at Kendra. There was a beat of silence, and then the woman nodded almost imperceptibly. "I'll handle it." Kendra slid a folded sheet of paper with a single address written on it across the counter. It belonged to a national investigative journalist, known for dismantling public officials with a single exposé. If the evidence inside the envelope made it into that journalist's hands, the trial would no longer be something the local power structure could control. She walked back to her seat, without looking toward the prosecution table. But she didn't have to. She could feel the shift in energy. Morrissey's head tilted slightly, his eyes following the clerk as she left the room. Keller's foot tapped under the table, a staccato rhythm that didn't match any casual impatience. They knew something had moved. Her attorney leaned toward her as she sat. "What did you just do?" "Changed the ending," she said quietly. From that moment, the temperature in the room rose. Calhoun stumbled over his next line of questioning, glancing toward the gallery more often than toward the witness. Morrissey began passing small slips of paper to him, each one crumpled before it was pocketed. Keller shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening every time Kendra's eyes met his. She wasn't smiling, but she let them see the calm in her expression. They needed to believe she was in control, even if that belief would make them desperate enough to make mistakes. Midway through the morning, the bailiff entered from a side door and approached the bench. He carried a folded note, its edges creased sharply, as if whoever had written it had pressed the paper too hard. The judge took it without breaking his expression. He opened it, scanned the contents, and his face changed. The controlled mask cracked just enough for a flash of something to appear. Surprise, then something closer to fear. He looked toward the prosecution table, then toward Kendra. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice tight, "we will take an immediate recess." The gavel struck, but the sound was sharper than before, as though the wood itself had absorbed the tension in the room. As As the judge rose and stepped into his chambers, Morrissey's chair scraped back violently. For the first time since the trial began, he didn't look like a man playing a part. He looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was starting to give way. By dawn, Charleston was no longer the same city Kendra had walked through the day before. She woke to the sound of her phone vibrating non-stop on the nightstand. Not from friends or family, but from push notifications, emails and messages from reporters she'd never spoken to. The national journalist had clearly received the envelope. The first headline she saw made her sit up. Leaked evidence ties Charleston officers to bribery, cover-ups and decade of abuse. The article was blunt. No careful hedging or deference to ongoing investigations. Photographs of unfiled case reports were splashed across the page, along with bank records, and grainy stills of Morrissey and handshakes that looked like deal. The Jane Doe file wasn't in the story yet, but the list of victims was long enough to spark outrage on its own. By mid-morning, the hashtags had begun. Justice for Charleston. Arrest Morrissey. Keller must go. Video clips of her silent, steady walk into court were spliced with the headline, transforming her into a symbol before she'd even opened her mouth. She sat at the small kitchen table in the safe house Isaac had arranged, the curtains drawn. The hum of the refrigerator was interrupted only by the muffled sound of shouting from outside. A protest had gathered down the block, their chants carrying in the humid air. "They've been here since sunrise," Marisol said from across the table, scrolling through her own phone. "Word is, more are on the way." Kendra didn't respond right away. The attention wasn't what she wanted. It was what she needed, strategically. But it was a dangerous kind of shield. Attention could protect her from quiet removal, but it also meant every move she made would be scrutinized. "Any official response from the department?" she asked finally. "Press conference at noon," Marisol said. "But I've already heard from my contacts inside. They're scrambling. Keller's been told to stay home. Morrissey hasn't been seen since yesterday afternoon." Kendra looked down at the open article again. It wasn't just the evidence itself. It was the fact it had been dumped into the public sphere without warning. The judge's chambers were reportedly flooded with calls from federal oversight committees by 9 a.m., and by 10, two national networks had sent crews to Charleston. For the first time since the trial began, she felt the balance of power shift. "They can't bury this anymore," she said, her voice low. "No," Marisol agreed. "But don't mistake noise for victory. They're still dangerous, maybe more so now that they're cornered." Outside, the chants grew louder. Through the crack in the curtain, Kendra could see a line of protesters holding signs. Some had her name scrawled across poster board. Others carried blown-up screenshots of the leaked documents. A young woman on a megaphone shouted, "We see you, Kendra Lawson," and the crowd roared back. She stepped away from the window. "This isn't about me," she said. "It is now," Marisol replied. "Whether you like it or not." The hours crawled by. She avoided the television, focusing instead on mapping the likely next moves from Morrissey's side. Potential allies they could still call in, pressure points they might use. Isaac hadn't checked in yet, which meant he was likely navigating the fallout in higher offices. Just after noon, Marisol's phone buzzed. She listened silently for a few seconds, before hanging up. Judge chambers are in chaos. They've had 3 federal investigators walk in unannounced this morning. Keller's name is officially on a subpoena. Morrissey's next. Kendra exhaled slowly. "And the judge?" "Quiet," Marisol said, which is worse than loud. Kendra poured herself a glass of water, the steady stream masking the thump of her pulse. The cracks in the system were visible now. But cracks didn't mean collapse. She'd seen systems like this repair themselves faster than anyone believed possible. All it took was one distraction, one shift in narrative. She was still thinking about that when her phone, her regular phone, not the burner, lit up with a breaking news alert. The headline was short, almost too simple. "Missing Officer Marcus Lawson found." Her breath caught. She tapped the notification. The article was bare bones. Marcus had been located late that morning on the edge of a rural county road, unconscious but alive. He was in critical condition at a nearby hospital, under guard. No suspects, no timeline of how he got there. She felt Marisol's eyes on her. "There's more," Kendra said, still scanning the article. "He's refusing to speak to anyone until he sees me, alone." "That's not safe," Marisol said immediately. "If he's been compromised, he's my brother," Kendra cut in. Safe stopped being the priority when they took him. Marisol didn't look convinced. "If they let you see him without resistance, it's because they want you there." Kendra closed the article, her decision already made. Then we'll find out why. Outside, the crowd's chants shifted suddenly, surging into a roar. A protester banged on the safe house door, shouting through the wood. They've moved him. If you want to see him, you have to go now. The hospital's fluorescent hallway stretched long and sterile, the hum of the lights blending with the distant beeping of machines. Kendra walked past two uniformed officers, stationed at the double doors to the ICU. Their eyes followed her like searchlights, scanning for any sign of what she carried inside her. Marisol stopped at the threshold. I'll wait out here. You get 10 minutes, maybe less. Kendra nodded, pushing open the door to her brother's room. Marcus lay against a raised bed, skin pale against the sheets, an oxygen cannula looped over his ears. His left arm was bandaged from elbow to wrist. Bruising bloomed along the side of his face, but his eyes, bloodshot, tired, were steady on her as soon as she stepped inside. You came, he said, his voice a rasp. She moved closer, pulling the chair up beside him. They said you wouldn't talk to anyone else. That's because you're the only one who believed me. He swallowed, wincing at the motion. They were going to make it look like a gang hit. Photos, ballistics, everything staged. Your name was going to be all over it. Local woman's brother killed in retaliatory violence. They wanted the jury to think you were connected to street crime. By the time the trial ended, you'd have no credibility left. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her voice even. And who's they in this version of the story? Marcus's gaze flickered toward the closed door. Morrissey, Keller. But it doesn't stop there. I heard them talking before they realized I was conscious again. They've got someone higher. Someone who can make warrants disappear. Move evidence without a trace. Who? She pressed. The judge, Marcus said, the words low but sharp. He's been covering for them for years. I know because I have it. An audio file. Morrissey bragging about how his honor cleans up their mess. Kendra froze. Where? I had it on my phone. They took that, but I backed it up before they grabbed me. It's on a drive, locked in my locker at the precinct. The air between them seemed to thicken. A secret recording implicating the presiding judge was more than leverage. It was a weapon that could end the trial in one blow or blow it wide open. Listen to me, Marcus said, gripping her wrist with his good hand. If you let the feds take it, it'll get buried in a sealed investigation. You need that audio in open court. On record. That's the only way it survives. Her mind was already moving through the possibilities, the risks. Then we make sure the trial continues. Marcus's expression shifted, part relief, part fear. That's what I was afraid you'd say. She stayed until the nurse came in to check his vitals. At the door, she looked back once, committing his face to memory before stepping into the hallway. Marisol was waiting. Well, Kendra didn't answer until they were halfway down the hall. We've got something bigger than the envelope. By the time they reached the parking lot, Isaac was already leaning against a black SUV, phone to his ear. He hung up as they approached. Federal agents are in the courthouse now, he said without preamble. They're circling Morrissey and Keller. But you've got a problem. The judge is trying to have the rest of the proceedings moved into closed chambers for security reasons. Not happening, Kendra said. I'm putting everything on the record. Isaac studied her. That'll paint a target you can't take off. It's already there, she said. The next morning, she walked up the courthouse steps flanked by two FBI agents in dark suits. Cameras exploded in flashes around them, reporters shouting questions over the hum of chanting protesters. Kendra kept her gaze forward, her posture unyielding, the manila envelope tucked under one arm. Inside, the mood was different, tense, brittle. The gallery was full, but the whispering was sharper now, as if everyone sensed the scales were tipping. At the defense table, her attorney leaned toward her. They know something's coming. Calhoun's been sweating since sunrise. She didn't look at the prosecution table as she replied. Good. The trial resumed with none of the casual arrogance that had marked its earlier days. Keller kept his head down. Morrissey sat stiff. His hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. The judge's voice was clipped, his eyes darting to the back of the courtroom between each statement. When it came time for closing arguments, Calhoun stood, his opening sentence sounding more like a plea than a declaration. Kendra listened without expression, her mind fixed on the moment to come. Then her attorney rose. Your Honor, he said. Before I address the jury, I have evidence that directly impacts the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses and the integrity of these proceedings. This evidence must be entered into the public record. The judge's eyes narrowed. Counselor, I will remind you. No, Your Honor, her attorney cut in. You will hear this. So will the jury. So will the people in this room who deserve to know the truth. The room shifted, bodies leaning forward. From her bag, Kendra produced a small flash drive. The copy Marcus had hidden at the precinct. Her attorney plugged it into a laptop already connected to the court's audio system. The recording crackled. Then came Morrissey's unmistakable voice. Doesn't matter what happens in court. His Honor will make it disappear. Same as last time. He's been keeping our books clean for a decade. A second voice followed. Lower, measured. The judge's voice. Just keep it quiet. My job is to make sure you're untouchable in that courtroom. The rest is up to you. The silence afterward was electric. The judge's face didn't redden. It went pale. He reached for his gavel, but before he could speak, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 2 federal marshals stepped inside. Your Honor, one said, walking forward. You're coming with us. The gallery erupted gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs, but Kendra stayed seated, watching as the judge was escorted away in handcuffs, the gavel still clutched loosely in one hand. Across the aisle, Morrissey turned toward her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not mockery, not arrogance, but the stark recognition that his shield had just been stripped away. The courtroom was still ringing with the shock of the judge's arrest, when the lead federal agent stepped forward. The murmur of voices broke into absolute silence, as he pulled a folded document from his inside jacket pocket. His voice carried easily, even without the microphone. For the record, and for the benefit of the press present, let it be known that Kendra Lawson is not, and has never been, the true defendant in these proceedings. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Cameras clicked furiously from the press benches. Even her attorney looked momentarily stunned, though the faint flicker in his eyes said he had suspected something all along. She has been operating in a covert capacity, the agent continued, as the incoming director of the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Her appointment, authorized months ago, was classified due to ongoing investigations into systemic corruption across multiple jurisdictions. The words hit the room like a slow-building thunderclap. Every set of eyes turned toward her. The woman they had been watching for weeks, mocked, belittled, humiliated, was suddenly revealed not as a cornered defendant, but as the architect of the entire operation. Kendra rose slowly, her movements deliberate. She didn't look at Morrissey or Keller yet. Instead, she faced the gallery, the townspeople, the reporters, the jurors whose expressions now wavered between disbelief and shame. When I walked into this courtroom, she began, her voice calm but carrying, I knew what I would face. I knew the names they would call me, the smirks, the whispers. I knew the rules of this place weren't written to protect people like me, and I knew that if I fought back too soon, the truth would die in the dark. The murmurs died entirely. Every head tilted forward to catch her words. She held up the now famous manila envelope. This was never about a traffic violation. It was about whether this city, and others like it, could be made to look itself in the mirror. In my time here, I have witnessed and documented bribery, falsified evidence, perjury, obstruction of justice, and abuses of power so routine they had become part of the culture. And the people responsible didn't just think they could get away with it, they laughed while they did. Kendra finally turned toward Morrissey and Keller. The 2 officers sat rigid, but their earlier bravado had collapsed into something smaller, tighter, a kind of stillness that comes when the fight is no longer winnable. You thought my silence was weakness, she said, her eyes locking on Morrissey's. It was the sound of a trap closing. The lead agent gave a subtle nod, and within seconds, 2 U.S. Marshals approached the prosecution table. Sergeant Blake Morrissey, Officer Dan Keller, the agent said, his tone flat and official. You are under arrest for racketeering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and multiple counts of civil rights violations. The cuffs clicked around their wrists, the metallic snap echoing through the wood-paneled room. The crowd erupted, not in applause but in a stunned, collective intake of breath. As they were escorted out, Morrissey glanced back once at Kendra. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply met his gaze, until he looked away. Turning back to the gallery, she continued. This was one courtroom in one city, but what we've seen here is not unique. These networks, judges, officers, prosecutors, all bound by mutual crimes, exist across the country. and they thrive in the silence between the truth and what gets written down. Reporters were scribbling furiously. Camera shutters were a constant staccato rhythm. "My role as director of the FBI's Civil Rights Division," she said, the title ringing like a gavel, "is to make sure those networks don't survive. Not here. Not anywhere." Her gaze swept the jury box, the benches, the press seats. She could see the faces of people who had chuckled when Morrissey mocked her testimony, people who had looked away when the racial slurs had been muttered, people who had assumed she was powerless because of the role she appeared to play. "You watched it happen," she told them. "Some of you believed it, some of you ignored it, and some of you laughed." She let that sink in before delivering the final blow. "The next time you laugh at someone in this room, remember they might just be your judge tomorrow." The gavel came down, not from the judge. He was gone, but from a federal magistrate who had stepped in mid-proceeding. "Court is adjourned." The crowd surged to its feet, the press calling her name, microphones thrust toward her as she stepped down from the defense table. She ignored them, her stride even, her face unreadable. Isaac was waiting near the side exit, Marisol just behind him. They said nothing as they guided her through a secured hallway, the noise of the courtroom fading behind them. Outside, the air was sharp with the scent of rain. A black SUV idled at the curb, its rear door already open. She paused for just a moment before getting in, glancing toward the edge of the gathered crowd. Protesters, supporters, and curious onlookers were all pressed together behind the barricades. And that's when she saw him, a tall, shadowed figure in a dark coat, standing perfectly still while the rest of the crowd moved and shouted. His face was obscured by the brim of a cap, but his posture was unmistakably deliberate, a predator's patience in the chaos. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the faint curve of a smile. Then he turned and disappeared into the throng. Kendra slid into the SUV, the door closing behind her. As the vehicle pulled away, she kept her eyes on the spot where the figure had stood. The trial was over, but in her gut, she knew the next fight had already begun. And whoever that man was, he was waiting for her. They tried to bury her with lies, but the truth rose higher